My name is Beatrice Holloway, and I never imagined I'd be the one whispering goodbye to my father while a monitor ticked out the last, stubborn beats of his heart. The ICU felt like a chapel built out of plastic and light sterile. Humming, unforgiving. I wrapped my fingers around his, willing warmth into a hand that had once taught me how to steady a wrench and a life. Rest, I told him, even as my voice shook. I've got it from here. His eyelids fluttered. A half-smile tried and failed. I pressed my forehead to his and memorized the feel of his stubble, the faint scent of antiseptic layered over machine oil that never truly left his skin. Then I stood, because staying would have broken me, and soldiers learn to break later. The hallway's fluorescent glare hit hard. I kept my eyes on the floor tiles, counting squares until the ache behind my ribs stopped barking. That's when I heard them two nurses at the station. Voices dipped in that careful hush people use when they know they shouldn't be talking at all. "He looks just like that man in Brookvale," one said. "Uncanny?" The other replied, "Could be his brother. If the family knew, he might be a donor." My steps stuttered. "Brother, my father doesn't have a brother." The word lodged like shrapnel. I drifted closer, pretending to study the vending machine, hearing the rustle of forms, the clatter of a pen, the casual cruelty of a secret spoken between sips of burnt coffee. "Healthy as a horse," the first nurse added. If only someone told them. The floor felt less solid than it had a second ago. I pictured my father's chest lifting under a thin blanket, and beside that image, a stranger's face wearing his bones. Hope rose like a flame I didn't trust. If there was even a sliver of truth, I couldn't ignore it. I squared my shoulders, tasted salt, and turned back toward the room I'd just left. Because if there was a fight left to pick, I was going to find it. I slipped back into my father's room, the door whispering shut behind me. The machines hummed their indifferent rhythm, reminding me that every beat was borrowed. He looked smaller than I remembered, sunk into the bed as if gravity had claimed more than his strength. The man who had once carried lumber on his back, without a second thought, now had tubes taped to his arms and lips pale from transfusions. I pulled the chair close and sat, resting my elbows on the rail. For a moment I didn't speak, I just studied him, memorizing the lines that carved his face. They were battle scars of another kind, years in factories, nights skipped for overtime, mornings where he carried both breakfast and silence to the table. He had never asked for pity. Not once. "Dad," I whispered, though his eyes were shut. They said there's nothing left to try. My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. "But I don't believe that. You always told me you fix what's broken. Or you find a way. You never just quit." His chest rose faintly, shallow but steady. I leaned closer, hoping some part of him still heard me. The memory of being 12 came back sharp grease under his nails, his voice steady as he told me, "You don't walk away. Be. Not from family, not from yourself." That lesson was burned into me, and now it was the only thing keeping me upright. I brushed my hand across his hair, rougher than I meant, as if by force I could anchor him. The thought of losing him gnawed deep, but the words from the nurses kept needling me. A man in Brookvale who looked just like him, healthy, strong, a potential donor. My breath caught. Was it a cruel coincidence, or something he had hidden? Why had he never told me I wanted to shake him awake, demand answers, but his body had nothing left to give? Instead, I kissed his temple, tasting the salt of my own tears. "Hold on for me," I murmured, voice breaking. "If there's even a thread of hope, I'll find it." The hallway waited outside, sterile and cold. But this time, I didn't leave with my head bowed. I left with a knot of anger and resolve, because I couldn't mourn him yet. Not when there might still be someone out there with the power to keep him alive. And if secrets were buried in his past, I would dig until my hands bled. The next morning, I returned to the hospital, with a soldier's steadiness pasted over the chaos inside me. My uniform wasn't on my shoulders, but the discipline was still in my spine. I walked past the nurses' station, catching their glances, daring them to repeat what I'd overheard. They didn't. The silence between us told me enough. They knew they'd said too much. I went straight to the records office, the one place in this entire building where hope might be filed under a code. The clerk looked at me like she'd rather be anywhere else. Family history, I said flatly. Anything connected to Robert Holloway. She sighed, flipped through screens, and disappeared into the back. I stood there, tapping my boot against the tile, every second like sand draining out of an hourglass. When she returned, she carried a thin folder and dropped it onto the counter as if it weighed nothing. I opened it. Buried between lab results and admission slips was a single line, scribbled like an afterthought: adopted. Birth family unknown. The word burned a hole straight through me. Adopted my father. The man who had built my entire definition of family had lived with a truth this massive and never spoken it. I felt the floor shift under me. A brother wasn't impossible anymore. It was suddenly probable. I pressed my palm to the counter, steadying myself. "Can I take copies?" The clerk shrugged. "If you sign the request," I signed without blinking, paper clutched tight in my hand. I walked back through the hospital corridors, my reflection flashing past glass doors. Every step carried a new weight. My father hadn't just left me with fading breaths. He'd left me with a mystery I couldn't ignore. I paused at his door, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. "You could have told me," I whispered. "But you didn't, so now it's my fight. Brookvale." That was the name the nurse had let slip. Small town. Close enough to reach before the sun went down. If there was a man there who wore my father's face, I would find him. And if he held the key to saving Dad's life, he wouldn't stay a stranger for long. The road to Brookvale stretched flat and endless, the kind of highway that left you alone with your thoughts until they clawed their way out. I drove with the folder balanced on the passenger seat, its thin weight heavier than any rucksack I'd carried overseas. Adopted. The word echoed each mile. My father's silence, every unanswered question from childhood, suddenly felt like a wall he had built to protect me or to protect himself. Brookvale wasn't much to look at. One main street with peeling storefronts, a diner with a flickering neon sign, and the kind of stillness that told me everyone knew everyone else's secrets. I parked outside the diner and stepped inside. The bell over the door announced me to the room. A handful of older men in ball caps lifted their eyes, then returned to their coffee. The waitress, sharp-eyed and wary, asked what I needed. I ordered coffee, then leaned forward. "I'm looking for someone, a man who looks a lot like Robert Holloway." Her hand froze on the pot. She studied me for a moment before setting it down. "Only one man fits that. Ethan Maddox, lives outside town, keeps to himself." She gave directions: an old farmhouse, barn half collapsed, out on Miller Road. The farmhouse looked abandoned at first glance, sagging wood and weeds crowding the steps. But when the door opened, a man stepped out. My breath caught. He wasn't my father, but he could have been his reflection. Same jawline, same way of squaring his shoulders like he was ready for a fight. He looked younger, beard rough, suspicion in his eyes. "You lost," he called out. I kept my hands visible, my voice steady. "Name's Beatrice Holloway, my father's Robert. He's in the hospital dying. I think you might be his brother." His expression hardened. For a heartbeat, I thought he'd slam the door. Then something flickered across his face: curiosity or recognition. "Name's Ethan Maddox," he said slowly. "And if you're saying what I think, you better come inside." The air between us felt charged, heavy with questions I wasn't ready for. But I followed, because if this man was family, he might be the last hope my father had left. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of wood smoke and dust. Ethan didn't offer coffee, just motioned toward a sagging couch while he stood across the room with his arms folded. Eyes narrowed. His stare felt like a test I hadn't studied for. "You say your father's Robert Holloway," he said. "What makes you so sure he's my kin?" I pulled the folded papers from my jacket, laid them on the table between us. "Because he was adopted, and because you look like him. I didn't come here chasing fairy tales." "Ethan! I came here because he's dying of aplastic anemia and needs a marrow donor." The name of the disease seemed to hang in the air, ugly and heavy. Ethan sank into the armchair, rubbing his beard. "Adopted." He muttered, "Figures. I found out about myself when I was 20. Never looked back. If they gave me away, I figured I didn't need them." I leaned forward, desperate. "I'm not asking you to rewrite history. I'm asking you to take a test. If you're a match, you could save his life." His jaw tightened, the silence stretching. I could see the war inside him, years of bitterness crashing against the chance to do something that mattered. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, sharp and tired. "I'll get tested," he said. "But don't expect miracles. Blood doesn't make family." Relief nearly buckled my knees, but I kept my voice steady. "Thank you. That's all I need. A chance." He grabbed his keys, the decision made but not softened. As we walked out to his truck, I caught a glimpse of the barn leaning in the distance. Red paint flaking like old scars. The place carried the weight of neglect, much like the man beside me. At the hospital, Ethan filled out the forms with curt strokes of his pen, leaving the next of kin line blank. I sat beside him in silence, watching the walls of his defenses hold firm. For the first time in days, though, I felt something new threading through my veins. Hope, fragile but real. And I wasn't about to let go of it. Waiting for Ethan's results gnawed at me. I drifted between the ICU and a cheap motel on the edge of town. My phone glued to my palm, jumping every time it buzzed. My father's breath stayed shallow, his skin pale. And each time I left his side, I whispered the same promise: "I'm not done fighting for you." One evening, restless, I stopped at a gas station. Inside, two men at the counter talked too loudly, their voices carrying in the near-empty store. "Third case this year," one muttered, shaking his head. "All blood problems. Folks living near the river. County won't touch it." The other replied, "Halstead's got half the council in his pocket. Been dumping for years." My grip on the coffee cup tightened until it cracked. Blood problems. My father's rare diagnosis. Echoed in strangers' lives. When I stepped outside, Ethan was leaning against his truck, cigarette smoke curling in the dusk. He caught my expression and narrowed his eyes. "What now? Nothing." I lied, sliding into the passenger seat, but the words buzzed in my skull. This wasn't chance. The next day, I drove past the river and saw it Halstead Industries. Smokestacks clawed at the sky, gray haze bleeding into the horizon. The acrid bite of chemicals clung to the air. I pulled off the road, phone in hand, snapping photos of rusted barrels stacked behind chain-link fences, some lids crooked, rainbow sheens on puddles beneath them. My stomach twisted. I'd seen cleaner dumps in war zones. When I circled back, a security guard in a neon vest leaned against my truck. "Lost?" he asked, eyes sharp. "Just driving through," I answered evenly. He smirked, stepping closer. "Not much to see here. Best keep moving." The message was clear. I drove away, heart pounding. That night, back at the hospital, I sat by my father's bed and brushed his hair back from his forehead. "I'm not abandoning you," I whispered. "I'll dig until I find the truth. And I'll make them pay." The monitor beeped steady and slow, as if daring me to keep my word. And I intended to. The following morning, I planted myself in the county records office, a building that smelled like dust and bureaucracy, beige walls, buzzing lights, and a clerk who looked like she'd been glued to her chair since the Cold War. I asked for inspection reports and permits tied to Halstead Industries. She shuffled away and returned with a stack so thin it could have slipped inside a magazine. I spread the pages out on the counter, each inspection stamped clean. No violations, year after year. My pulse ticked faster. I knew what I'd seen behind that fence: crooked barrels, rainbow puddles, the sour sting of chemicals in the air. These papers weren't just wrong, they were lies. I took photos of every page, tucking the evidence into my jacket before sliding the stack back. The clerk gave me a look that said, "Waste of time." But I was already walking out into the harsh sunlight, more convinced than ever. That night, I drove to the county library. Small towns keep their sins in obituaries and gossip columns. On the microfilm reels, I started seeing a pattern: young men, mothers in their 40s, kids barely out of school, all with rare blood disorders, all gone too soon. I wrote down names, dates, addresses. The closer I looked, the clearer it became. Most lived within miles of the river. When I finally pushed back from the machine, my eyes ached and my notebook was full. This wasn't random tragedy. It was a graveyard carved by negligence. Back at my motel, I laid out the notes across the bedspread. My phone buzzed. The hospital. For a moment, my breath froze. "Ms. Holloway," the voice said, calm but steady. "Preliminary results show Mr. Maddox is a probable sibling-level match. We'll need confirmatory tests, but the markers align." The words crashed over me like oxygen after drowning. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles whitened. My father had a chance, thanks to a brother he never knew. But as I looked at the names in my notebook, I knew saving him wouldn't be enough. Justice had to come with it. By the time I reached Ethan's farmhouse again, dawn was burning across the fields. He was sitting on the porch like he'd never moved, boots propped up, a beer bottle at his feet, even though the day was barely awake. "You're a match," I said, skipping any greeting. His eyes narrowed. "Preliminary. Doesn't mean I'm handing over bone marrow tomorrow." I stepped closer. "No. But it means you're the best chance we've got. And right now, that's everything." He looked past me at the horizon, jaw working. Guess that means I don't get to keep pretending I don't belong to anyone. I didn't press him further. There would be time for those questions. For now, I needed him willing. We drove back to the hospital together, his silence filling the cab. At the admissions desk, he scrawled his name with stiff fingers. I noticed he skipped the line for emergency contact, sliding the clipboard back without hesitation. Walls don't crumble in a day. While the nurses whisked him away for blood work, I lingered in the corridor. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. A smooth voice oiled through the speaker. "Beatrice Holloway, you've been busy." My stomach clenched. "Who is this Victor Halstead?" he said, as if his name carried a crown. "I hear you've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong. That binder of rumors and old photos you've been gathering it won't matter. Money talks louder than paper. Remember that." I forced my voice steady. "You've poisoned this town. People are dying. My father is dying. You won't bury that." He chuckled low. "People die for all sorts of reasons. Stress, bad habits, genetics. Blaming me is convenient. But it won't stick. Walk away, soldier, or you'll regret it." The line clicked dead. My hands shook around the phone, but beneath the fear came a surge of clarity. He had just confirmed everything without meaning to. When Ethan returned from the lab, rubbing his arm, he caught my expression. What I exhaled slowly. He knows I'm coming for him. And now I know he's afraid. And that meant the real fight had only just begun. The days that followed blurred into one long vigil. My father fought through the transplant, fevered and fragile, while Ethan recovered in the next room, pale but standing. I shuttled between them, a soldier on double watch, refusing to surrender to exhaustion. Then, little by little, color returned to my father's face. His voice grew steadier, his grip stronger. Hope, once a whisper, became something I could touch. Beyond those hospital walls, the storm finally broke. Federal marshals raided Halstead Industries. Cameras caught Victor Halstead in handcuffs, his empire crumbling as evidence poured out leaking barrels, falsified reports, testimonies from the workers he'd silenced. For once, the powerful man with the perfect suit looked small, swallowed by the justice he thought he'd outrun. Weeks later, when my father walked out of the hospital on his own 2 feet, Ethan stood beside him, awkward but present. At the kitchen table that night, Dad lifted his glass. "To family," he said. Ethan added, "To second chances." And I raised mine to the word that had carried me through it all. "To justice," I whispered, because revenge hadn't been about rage or ruin. It was about truth winning, life enduring, and a family unexpected and imperfect finally sitting together at the same table.